A summit that returns Washington back to the international fold on climate as the United States president pledged to slash the country's greenhouse gas emissions by at least 50% by 2030.
We know just how critically important that is because scientists tell us that this is the decisive decade. This is the decade we must make decisions that will avoid the worst consequences of the climate crisis. We must try to keep the Earth's temperature to an increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius. You know, the world beyond 1.5 degrees means more frequent and intense fires, floods, droughts, heat waves, and hurricanes, tearing through communities, ripping away lives and livelihoods.
President Ramaphosa called the climate challenge the most pressing issue of our time, leaving developing economies particularly vulnerable, as he emphasized the principle of common but differentiated responsibility.
The move towards a low-carbon, climate-resilient society cannot happen overnight. We need to work together to create a climate-resilient society, and amongst other things, we should firstly ensure that as we transit to a more climate-resilient future, it must be based on a just transition that ensures that those who are most vulnerable in society do not get left behind.
He pointed to a process underway to update the country's nationally determined contributions.
The top of the 2030 range has been reduced by 28%, or 174 million metric tons, which is a very significant reduction. Second, according to our previous nationally determined contribution, South Africa's emissions would peak and plateau in 2025 and decline only from 2035. South Africa's emissions will begin to decline from 2025, effectively shifting our emissions decline 10 years earlier.
China, the world's largest emitter, affirmed its pledge to reach carbon neutrality by 2060, while urging leaders to take a people-centered multilateral approach to climate mitigation.
We need to give full recognition to developing countries' contribution to climate action and accommodate their particular difficulties and concerns. Developed countries need to increase climate ambition and action and make concrete efforts to help developing countries accelerate the transition to green and low-carbon development.
Russia's leader pointed to the need to not merely mitigate, but to reduce carbon dioxide that is already stuck in the Earth's atmosphere.
It is also important to take up the task of absorbing the CO2 that has accumulated in the atmosphere. Let me say that without exaggeration, Russia makes a gigantic contribution to absorbing global emissions, both ours and from elsewhere, owing to the great absorption capacities of our ecosystems.
Canada, Japan and the European Union vowed to cut emissions from between 40% at the low end and 55% at the upper end by 2030, in what some refer to as a make-or-break decade.
We must put a price on carbon, shifting taxation from income to carbon, and subsidies for fossil fuels. Ramp up investments in renewable energy and green infrastructure. Stop the financing of coal and the building of new coal power plants, and phase out coal by 2030 in the wealthiest countries and by 2040 everywhere else.
A reinvigorated effort towards meeting the goals set out in the Paris Climate Change Accord, also known as humanity's life insurance policy. Sherwin Bryce-Pease, SABC News, New York.
Right, let's get some more details live with Sherwin now from New York. Sherwin, thank you. The opening day of the summit talking about all these climate solutions, the investments, but it was also really about welcoming the United States back into the fold, wasn't it?
In many ways, the US apology tour on the international stage continues, Francis. After the absence and the unilateralism you saw under the previous administration, there is a real effort from the Biden administration to reassert the United States leadership role on various international files, including the climate change agenda. And this, of course, was not lost on some of the leaders that joined, including the Chancellor of Germany and the Prime Minister of the UK. Watch.
I'm delighted to see that the United States is back to work together with us in climate politics, because there can be no doubt about the world needing your contribution if we really want to fulfill our ambitious goals. And the national contribution of the United States for 2030 is a clear illustration of your ambitions. That is a very clear and important message to the international community.
I'm not saying any of this is going to be easy, and there is obviously going to be a political challenge. And I think it's very important to go back to the original words of President Biden, because it's vital for all of us to show that this is not all about some expensive, politically correct green act of bunny hugging. Or however you want to put it. I'm not wrong with bunny hugging, but you know what I'm driving at, friends and colleagues. This is about growth and jobs.
It's not about bunny hugging, according to the British Prime Minister, Francis. It's about growth and jobs. And I think hitting the nail on the head in terms of the national conversations that are happening around the world, no less here in the United States, probably in South Africa and elsewhere, that this is not about being politically correct. This is an urgent moment, and all the world nations need to come together for a collective approach if we are going to meet the targets set in the Paris Climate Change Accord and the Sustainable Development Goals of 2030 with the 2030 deadline. It's an all-hands-on-deck approach, Francis.
Yeah, Boris Johnson frames things in interesting ways. So, Sherwin, in these conversations, there's talk of a green transition, adaptation, mitigation. But essentially, what's being spoken about here is financing, which is often the elephant in the room. How was the question of financing addressed?
That is the real big focus. When you talk about scaling up ambition and, raising your levels of ambition on a national level and an international level, you're talking about where is the money going to come from. And a number of countries, among them New Zealand and international financial institutions like the International Monetary Fund, are talking about four key areas, Francis. I'll read them to you quickly. They talk about taxing carbon, putting a price on industries that are emitting carbon into the atmosphere, to make climate-related financial disclosures mandatory. This is a focus on the private sector where, for example, requiring banks and large lenders to divulge climate risks to their investors, and including climate risk reporting in a company's financials, right? This is a new era now. This would be very, very new. And to end, you heard the SG there talking about ending fossil fuel subsidies and rediverting that finance to adaptation and mitigation. This is something President Ramaphosa also touched on. Let's watch him.
We must scale up support in the form of financing, technology and capacity building. It will not be possible for developing economy countries, including those in Africa, to enhance ambition on either adaptation or mitigation. Fourthly, it is important that aid on climate change should be provided separately and should not be part of conventional development assistance. When it is given in the form of loan financing, the debt burden of developing countries is worsened. We call on developed economies, which historically bear the greatest responsibility for emissions, to meet their responsibilities to developing economies.
The South African president referring to the Green Climate Fund, which developed countries in terms of the Paris Climate Change Accord have agreed to capitalize to the tune of $100 billion on an annual basis moving forward from 2020. It didn't meet that target last year, and the president there calling out the developed world that they need to start meeting their commitments if the world can move forward on this issue collectively.
Yeah. Do you agree, Sherwin? He was very frank there, saying Africa can't just do this. It needs help, and it needs those promises to be met that have already been made.
You know, it's a summit about frank talk. I mean, we've been preaching this message. You know, we are based at the United Nations here in New York. This is a central issue. As much as there's been a great deal of urgency, Francis, on dealing with the coronavirus pandemic and getting vaccines out to people, this is a very short-term issue, right? Climate change was there before the pandemic, and it is it poses a far greater risk than the coronavirus pandemic. And what the world needs now is the level of urgency that you saw vis-a-vis the pandemic to be applied to the climate change catastrophe, because the damage and the catastrophe it's going to bring is going to be far worse than any virus could ever affect. So, yeah, plain talk is what it's all about.
Yeah. And was there honesty, finally, Sherwin, about possibly fatigue, about catastrophes? You know, the world has taken a lot. COVID-19 has sort of topped the agenda for so long and consumed so many resources and energy. Is there still enough political will, enough energy to push at this crucial stage around climate change?
The level of commitment, the commitments, remember, this was a summit where countries were bringing their nationally determined contributions, basically what I'm going to do and what you're going to do and how we're going to do this together. And we heard from some of the leaders, you heard the President of the United States talk about reducing their carbon footprint by up to 52% by 2030. This is a firm commitment. We also heard from countries like Canada. Canada says they will reduce their carbon footprint by 2030 from between 40 and 45%. Japan, also one of the large economies in the world, by 46% by 2030. China says it will start beginning to, its emissions will plateau in 2030, and they will reach zero net neutrality, carbon neutrality by 2060. So we're seeing firm commitments here, Francis. We're not just talking about vacuous statements about what we hope to achieve. These are fundamental issues that countries are now putting on the table. And of course, the real question is going to be, will places and organizations like the international multilateral institutions like the UN be able to hold these countries to account based on the commitments they've now made?
Yeah, like you say, those are significant, but let's see the follow-through. Thank you so much for that update, Sherwin Bryce-Pease, live for us from New York.